Okay, hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Script Apart, a podcast about the first draft secrets of great movies and TV shows. My name's Al Horner, and this week on the show, alienation, abandonment, and dislocated shoulders. Not your typical ingredients for a heartwarming festive movie, but then again, The Holdovers, our film this week, and unequivocally one of my favourite movies of the last 12 months, is not your average Christmas film. Directed by the great Alexander Payne and written by our guest today, the brilliant David Hemingson, it's a drama steeped in the hurt of reaching the so-called most wonderful time of the year and feeling nothing but loneliness. The film tells the tale of three loners thrown together by circumstance over the Christmas break at a New England boarding school, each one disillusioned with a world that doesn't seem to want them. One of them, Paul, played by Paul Giamatti, is a miserly middle-aged academic with an odour problem. Another, Angus, played by newcomer Dominic Sessa, is a livewire student of his on the brink of being sent to military school. Last but not least, we have Davine Joy Randolph's Mary Lamb, the school cook, a woman who recently lost everything. These characters find a richness in each other across the course of The Holdovers that's uplifting without ever feeling schmaltzy. It is, in short, a staggeringly beautiful film with a screenplay so touching that had the Oscars not nominated it for Best Original Screenplay this week, I may well have rioted in the streets. Luckily, the Academy Awards got this one right. In the spoiler conversation that you're about to hear, David tells me about his Uncle Earl, the real-life family member that he based Paul on. You'll hear how his first draft involved a woman that Paul used to date with porcelain fingers after injuring her hand in a car accident. We also spend some time debating the words, "Not for ourselves, alone are we born," the lesson, if there is one, of this incredible movie. Massive thanks to David for being such a fantastic guest and for reminding me to revisit Stephen King's On Writing because it's been a while. And a massive thank you also to our Patreon supporters as ever. If you're not yet a member of that community, you can get involved by heading to patreon.com/scriptapart, where for the price of a single monthly cup of coffee, you'll get ad-free episodes, early access to episodes, and all sorts of other perks. That address one more time in case you're interested, it's patreon.com/scriptapart. Okay, that's all the admin out the way. Let's jump in, shall we? This is the wonderful David Hemingson discussing the first draft secrets of The Holdovers. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. You're listening to Script Apart, hosted by me, Al Horner, with production by Camille Demecq. David, such a joy to have you with us. How's it going today?
It's going well. It's a little overcast here in Los Angeles, but that's all right. A little chilly, but you guys are in Britain, obviously.
You can tell from our pale complexions.
Yeah. But it's also kind of romantic. It's very Jane Austen-esque. You guys have the Jane Austen complexion, I like to say.
Well, that's a Script Apart first. We haven't heard that before.
Exactly. So no, it's cool. I'm well today. I'm very excited to be talking to you guys about The Holdovers. Very excited.
Yeah, we're speaking in January, David, coming out of a festive season where The Holdovers was released in the US and not just embraced, but really cherished. Like, the number of people who've announced to me that they're going to watch The Holdovers every Christmas for the rest of their lives at this point it's wild. Like, and to those people, I always just say back, yeah, me too. How special was this past December, kind of witnessing people flock to this film? A film that, as we'll discuss across this conversation, you put parts of yourself into, you put parts of your mother, huge parts of a beloved uncle, I hear. It must have been a really special few weeks.
Yeah, it's extraordinary. I mean, the weird thing is we finished it. I started writing the movie about 5 years ago. And so we finished it in 2022. And so once it kind of went to market and Focus bought it, they felt like they wanted to do the holiday release, but they didn't think they had an adequate ramp into 22. And so we held it for this year. So we've been sort of waiting for a year and a half for this finished film to arrive. And so I'll be candid, I've been in television for like 27 years. I've written a ton of TV, and this is my first produced feature. I've written a couple other features, but my first produced feature. So when you're waiting for this, it's a fascinating thing because you watch it and you think you have something, and mean, I can just speak for myself, and I think I can speak for Alexander and Paul, certainly, but we knew we had something. We didn't really know what we had until we were in the editing bay, and a friend of Alexander's sort of pulled me aside and said, I think this is really resonant. I think this is a very emotional film. And, I'm so close to it that it was hard for me to fully appreciate and understand what it might mean to other people. And so to have it come out this Christmas after a kind of year and a half of the drum roll, the drum roll was just awesome, man. I mean, what can I tell you? I mean, I love this movie to my very bones because it's so much of it, of my life and my history and the people that I love are in it. So it's been exquisite. It's been really, really lovely to have people respond to it. I feel like, it's a movie about kindness. Ultimately, it's a love story about three broken people who kind of find each other in the season of miracles, and and kind of heal each other by letting down their guard and kind of exhibiting some kindness to each other. And so that, I think, it's an important message. So just to see that's resonating with people means a lot. I know that's a bit of a long answer. I apologize.
No, it's great. I love how it is a love story, as you say, but it's not a love story in a conventional sense. It's a love story in which it's a platonic love that reaches across backgrounds. These three characters that we're going to be talking about, they're thrown together by circumstance. Each of them might have been having a very different Christmas break, had tragedy not intervened, had professional rivals not intervened, had neglectful parents not intervened. But through their loneliness, they find something in each other. Why was that a special thing to explore? Where did that come from?
I just feel like I kind of go back to when I was a kid and my folks split up. I was about 5 years old. My mom, we were lower middle class family. My mom was a nurse. And it was just the two of us a lot of the time, And she was definitely going through a lot because we were broke, and my dad was the love of her life, and it kind of collapsed in a bad way. And for me, the idea of exploring the issues of loneliness and transcendence and connection just paramount in my life. There have always been sort of a subtext in my work. I didn't really understand the degree to which that was actually the case until I started writing the Holdovers, and I realized, oh, this is kind of what you've been sniffing around for the last 27 years, these thoughts, theories, ideas, opinions, these sort of themes. So have I been responsive? Does that answer your question? I hope so.
It does. It actually reminds me of something else. Like a few years ago, we had Shane Black on the show, and I asked him about this feeling that exists on the fringes of his movies, which famously are often also set against like a similar Yuletide backdrop. He talked about how for a lot of us at Christmas, and the quote is, there's a feeling of being outside the window, looking in, wondering how they all have that brightly lit Christmas room filled with love and laughter while I'm out in the snow. And I thought about that quote during what you were just describing and while watching The Holdovers, which really does have so much to do with alienation and loneliness and abandonment, and how the sting of that is so much greater at Christmas, because there is this expectation of festive cheer and of us all being able to kind of like engage in that cheer. Does that chime with what you were trying to do in specifically writing The Holdovers as a Christmas movie?
Yeah, I think Christmas is a really fraught period. I think it's a wonderful period. There's certainly, like you say, a lot of magic that rides behind it. There's kind of Dickensian tropes that we all love, that we all gravitate toward. But it is an incredibly fraught time for people. There's a lot of self-harm that goes on during Christmas. There's a lot of, alcohol abuse and other stuff that goes along at Christmas, as well as festivities, and then sometimes when you do have family and you collide with that family, it's not always the easiest Christmas. But, Shane Black's observation about the feeling of alienation, which, we often carry with us, being enhanced or amplified during this period, is absolutely one of the things I was thinking about. There's no better time to kind of catch people out and examine the contours of their loneliness than at Christmas time. Just no better time, because there's an expectation, like you're saying, that kind of brightly lit Christmas window that we're staring into. And interesting enough, I'm glad you said staring into. I'm glad he said it and you raised it, because the bottom line is that if you look at I guess it's just a spoiler alert for those of you who haven't seen the movie, but there's a moment there, and I very much wrote it this way. And Alexander and I were very much kindred spirits. Very much kindred spirits. We're very close friends and kindred spirits. And I wanted to shoot that scene when the M80 goes off from outside the building, like we shot it, because I wanted to have that sort of almost like Currier and Ives snapshot in through those windows, of the thing that they were all missing prior to that, but they all had, and literally the explosion for me was metaphorically them kind of like both an explosion is a celebration, like fireworks, but also kind of blowing up the boundaries between them, but we see it from outside. We see this sort of thing from outside, like we often see, Christmas tableaus or like a snow globe. I mean, it resonates with the snow globe metaphor that I was using earlier as well.
I know that your involvement in the film, David, began with Alexander Payne ringing you up. And you believed it was your buddy Bob at first, who had this habit of impersonating filmmakers. So you nearly hung up. And then after that, well, once you did actually hear out Alexander, having initially thought you were being wound up, he handed you this logline that you were asked to adapt on the strength of a pilot that you'd written, also set in the 70s. And that pilot was called Stonehaven.
Stonehaven was set in 1980. Yeah, exactly.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Right. So the logline that you were handed, from what I understand, it was: an ocularly challenged odoriferous professor is stuck at Christmas looking after kids as a form of punishment. One of these kids has been abandoned by their mother. We've got to go through that logline part by part because, honestly, I imagined that some of the things evidently baked into the character of Paul from the very beginning, I thought those things may have been found along the way, but instead, from the sounds of things, from the very beginning, this character was going to be ocularly challenged, as Alexander puts it. He was also going to be someone who had this condition that makes him smell kind of bad. Why was that important from the off in terms of who this character was going to be?
For Alexander, like we talk about isolation, we were just talking about the theme of isolation, and I think, we learn a lot about Paul's backstory, and I've been very careful to just bleed in like little kernels of it, such as, late in the movie, I'm not my father, no matter how hard he tried to beat that idea into me. A very challenging relationship with his dad. We learn that later, but from the get-go, I think AP wanted him to be, and I think he picked up this premise from like a 1935 French movie about a guy who was like, wall-eyed and smelled bad. He just loved the premise, the idea that here's a man who's the ultimate outcast, who from the get-go had so many strikes against him that the wall was going to be impossible to climb. And I loved it immediately because the more challenges you lay on top of a character, to overcome, it's a high bar. It's a bit of man on wire situation. You're walking between the towers. But what's great about that is you're obliged to really explore ways in which to break down the boundaries based upon those things. Like if you have to overcome these terrible kind of, disabilities fundamentally. I mean, he's mocked, he overcorrects. His intellect is all he has because he's sort of like the Hunchback of Notre Dame, you know what I'm saying? So he's kind of been marginalized and diminished, and he overcorrects by building this wall up, So I think having a character have those challenges and having overcome those challenges makes for an interesting journey, and it makes for interesting impediments for him to overcome and for other people to push against. So that's why it was so important, as a sort of threshold matter for the character,
It's interesting. You mentioned him using his intellect as almost a shield there. It's so fascinating, his relationship with academia and the way it forms this protective barrier that keeps people out. He lionizes it in these academic terms. Like he describes always being drawn to the aesthetic of loneliness. And it's funny that there's a scene early on in the film, as we meet this guy, in which he recites the Latin for "not for ourselves alone we are born." He may know that phrase and its translation, but he won't learn the meaning of that mantra for himself until the end of the film.
Exactly right. That was a very conscious choice on my part. I wanted to do it because I wanted him to be sort of, I wanted to place this sort of idea out there. But for him, it's more of a recitation of some sort of abstract Stoic philosophy that he sort of wears, almost like a badge. This is who I am. This is this is what I stand for. But to say you stand for something or to advance some theory is radically different than living by those terms. Barton man. Another thing is I'm a Barton man. Barton men do not lie. Well, Barton man ends up lying to save this young man. So he kind of rewrites what it means to be a Barton man. He rewrites what it means to embrace that Stoic philosophy. He definitely sort of, he wears his academic credentials and his intellect as a shield, as armor. And it's the process of taking that armor off, and discovering his emotional intelligence. Like he has tremendous intellectual intelligence, but discovering his emotional intelligence, that's the journey of the character over the course of the story.
You wrote the character Paul for Paul Giamatti. But you've described taking great inspiration from an uncle, a man that saved my life, as you've previously put it. Can you tell me about that man, a man named Earl? Who was Earl?
Trying to see if there are any pictures of him around here anywhere. There's one on my phone. But yeah, there's a guy named Earl Cahill. My folks split up when I was like 5, and it was very acrimonious. Like I said, we were broke, and it was a tough time for my mother. She was working insane hours. She'd get up at 4:45 in the morning so she could be home in time when I got back from public school to make me dinner. So she was exhausted and strung out, and financially we were on kind of a knife's edge. And this guy who was my mother's sister's husband. My mother had a sister named Anne, and she married this guy named Earl Cahill. And Earl was this sort of bald, pot-bellied um, dude with Buddy Holly glasses and like jug handle ears, right? He was no one, I think I mentioned this in an article, he was like no one's idea of a Hollywood hero, but he was 10 times cooler because he had this incredibly rich life. He was born in 1920 in Anacortes, Washington, which is like right on the coast of Washington. Grew up on an island. Never heard the radio until he was like 9 years old. So he grew up literally going to school on a horse. I mean, it sounds apocryphal. It does sound apocryphal, but it's totally true. And then he sort of found his way. He got drafted. I think he enlisted actually to get out of getting drafted. So he enlisted and he went to Saipan. He fought on Saipan, which is one of the Japanese occupied islands, in the Pacific campaign during World War II, as a young man, and kind of a clerk typist, kind of a Raider O'Reilly type, but forced to pick up a gun. He'd grown up hunting and fishing in the wilds of Washington State, and stared down a lot of scary shit when he was out there and saw a lot of terrible things, as a lot of those World War II vets did. And on the B side, kind of wandered a little Hemingway-esque, wandered through Europe after the war, trying to find himself, ended up working for the United Nations and meeting my aunt Anne and marrying her. And all of a sudden kind of stumbled into my life. Like my mother's marriage collapses. There's her sister's husband who just shows up and sees me and sees something in me and never had a kid of his own and decides to sort of adopt me, and in doing so, just transformed me because, it was a really fraught period. I think I was what would be called now an at-risk kid. I'm a strange person, I guess. And, back when I was in grammar school, the concept of bullying, not only was it present, but it was considered almost like par for the course, like nobody stepped in. So if you were a bookish, bespectacled kid, which I was, you got the stuffing knocked out of you fairly regularly. I mean, I was beaten by more than one kid on numerous occasions, and it really impacts your self-esteem. It really, creates a degree of sadness in you. It gets you very kind of on edge constantly. It creates tremendous anxiety. And this guy kind of stepped in, and as opposed to just sort of saying to me, he did say to me in his own way, it's going to be okay. You're worthy. But more importantly, he said, like, if you're looking for somebody to feel sorry for you, you're looking at the wrong guy. This is not about me feeling sorry for you. This is me about me putting you on your feet and teaching you what's what, because the world, as he said, and that's an Earl quote, for most people, the world is like a henhouse ladder, shitty and short. So he was like, what are you going to do about it? What are you going to do about it? Are you going to just put up with it? Are you going to like take this, or are you going to change your life? Because he said to me, he quoted my Italian grandmother, who said to me, you're too stupid to be a doctor, so you may want to consider becoming a lawyer. And he was sort of like, yeah, you need to get a solid education. You need to get, the one thing you have is whatever's got between your ears. I wasn't particularly athletic. I was extremely nearsighted, a bookish kid. But he said, you're smart, so let's get that going. Let's get your physical body into shape. And he did, like in the movie when he talks about speed, gentlemen, speed. Without sufficient exercise, the body devours itself. I was awakened in the mornings as a kid with him banging on the door, screaming, or shouting like, wake up, kid, it's daylight in the swamp, get out. Kind of a drill sergeant in some respects, but also a guy who listened to me, who turned me on to the Beatles and the Stones and Canned Heat and Quicksilver Messenger Service, all the stuff albums that had been lying around his apartment in New York. Taught me how to hunt, taught me how to fish, taught me how to fight, taught me how to live a life that was fully engaged, and taught me how to be kind to people. Like, for as tough as he was always leading with kindness. He had a tremendous number of friends. So Earl Cahill was a remarkable man. Worked at the UN as the head of the press department. He was chief kind of press officer of the United Nations for 30 years. I remember as a kid going to his apartment in New York, and dinner parties with like Danny Kaye and Connie Chung and all these sort of New York luminaries of the 70s and 60s, 70s, and basically 60s and 70s, and they all loved him. Like he, the secretaries general of the UN like wrote personal letters to him when he retired. Several secretaries general. So the guy was just a Renaissance man, and Paul Hunnam is so much of Paul Hunnam is Roca Hale, so much. And that kind of grudging love, that sort of show don't tell love, where he showed love in a certain way that was tougher and a little, it was from a different era, a different age, and he also fed me books. He fed me Dickens, he fed me Horatio Alger, he fed me the Thomas Hughes books, Tom Brown at Rugby, Tom Brown at Oxford, Tom Brown School Days, which, I think were from the 1880s, and kind of chronicle this young British boy, scholarship boy, going to, Rugby in Oxford. And one of the greatest literary villains of all time, Flashman, Harry Flashman, is in those books. But that gave me sort of a romantic sensibility, turned me into an Anglophile, but also, endowed in me, or at least I think provoked in me, the idea that you can be the hero of your own story, And I think that's what Paul kind of says to Angus at the end, when he's basically saying, you are not your father. This is your life. You have time to turn it around. The idea that you have agency in your own life, and you don't have to be, you aren't your past. You have had terrible things happen, but they don't define you going forward. I mean, that's all Earl. So I could talk for another 2 hours about how wonderful he is, but that was a huge part of it.
So with Earl as a template of sorts for Paul, you sit down and you write your first draft of the film.
Exactly.
I'm aware of, or I've heard of a first draft of this film in which Paul had a girlfriend who he was in a car crash with. And the girlfriend, as a result, has 5 porcelain fingers. And in this version, the focus was much more on Paul, unlike in the final film, in which it's through witnessing this kid Angus and his coming of age that Paul experiences the epiphanies that he needs to move forward in his life. Tell me about that draft, David. I'm very intrigued by the 5 porcelain fingers.
Stephen King describes writers as you're one of two kinds of writers. You're either he says, and it's a great book. Let me just plug Stephen King's book on writing, because I've read a lot of books on writing, and there are many good books on writing, like Sid Field and, McKendrick on filmmaking and stuff. There's tons and tons and tons. If anybody out there, any of you screenwriters out there, want to read just a great fast read, it's not specific to screenwriting, but it's called On Writing by Stephen King. But he describes two kinds of writers, fundamentally: plotters and pantsers. Plotters are people who are very methodical, like John Irving would be a good example of a novelist who's a plotter. Legal pads, extensive writing, extensive note-taking, extensive sort of rumination. What happens next is the motor, as much as, his character is the motor. I'm a plotter because I'm an attorney by training. I went to law school, and I practiced for 3 years, 3 months, and 2 days, but who's counting? And I quit fairly young. But, and then there are pantsers. And so I'm a plotter. So 5 porcelain fingers really was my stab. What I like to do is write little short stories sometimes before I begin a movie, just to see if I can kind of like tell the story in paragraph form. Almost like, Raymond Carver is a great hero of mine. And so is, in terms of his writing, Roald Dahl, in terms of like, the what happens next of it all. So can you tell a story that's compelling, that satisfies kind of my corruption of Mamet's big 3 questions? It's my kind of corruption of his version. I think he has 4, but who's the character? What do they want? What happens if they don't get it? So thinking about what's going to engage the reader, because we don't, or viewer, because we don't do this in a vacuum, right? So 5 porcelain fingers is me just kind of going, hey, it would be interesting if this guy was stuck there and was being haunted by this thing. And in the story, she started sending him a finger every year to remind him, and he was being anguished. And so that started pinging off his discovery of her, and he and Angus went to find her. And Alexander, who's the consummate gentleman, read 5 porcelain fingers and was like, I really like this. It's got, unbidden, unsolicited. He was like, it's got kind of a Raymond Carver quality. I'm like, I love it. Fantastic. I love Carver so much. And he was like, this is not the movie though. But, it's sort of like, this is not where I want to go. And so I finally said to him, like, what aren't you responding to it? Because, Paul Giamatti was sort of the template from early on. And I said, this Paul would crush this. He goes, yeah, but he's like, I'm not really sure I care about Paul as much as I care about the kid, and Paul's redemption is less important to me than the kid's redemption and the kid's future. And so that was a fundamental recalibration early on. It was like, okay, start thinking in this in terms of what's happening with the kid and see if Paul, can drive it, but also allow the kid to evolve, which was an interesting exercise from a writing standpoint, because, your tip of the spear and your point of view is everything. Like who are you going to be rooting for in all this? And ideally, I hope in the Holdovers we're rooting for all three of our kind of holy family of Paul, Mary, and Don and Angus. But the idea of using him and his experience as sort of the way in emotionally was the adjustment that he encouraged me to make, and the adjustment that I made. So then it became about, the kid. I knew the kid was going to get left behind, but it's the kid's journey and Paul's sort of growth and his revelations ride behind it. So that was the fundamental change. And then once that was figured out, I banged out 30 pages. And here's the freaky thing, man. Those first 30 pages came like that. And I'm going to tell you, I'm not being self-aggrandizing. Believe me, I agonize constantly, constantly. I always like to say I spend the vast majority of my day standing in this room and shouting at the screen, what happens next? And whatever time is left in the day, standing in front of my open refrigerator, shouting, the answer is not in here. So, which is, a sign now, actually, it says the answer is not in here. So every time I open the fridge, I see it. It was a fascinating thing because the first 30 pages broke so fast. They broke so goddamn fast. I was like, I literally, man, I was just like, I sat down and like, blap, like within 2 days, I had the first 30 pages of the screenplay. And I sent them to Alexander. He's like, I love these. And it's pretty much, that takes us pretty much up through right before the other boys leave in the original iteration. And then we kind of got stuck because I was trying to get, he's like, do you want to keep the kids around or not? Because I'd outlined certain things that were in the outline, the broad stroke outline. But what I've discovered is oftentimes my outline changes as I write the movie. I wouldn't say oftentimes, almost always, but you kind of want to get to a certain point. So I knew I wanted some level of redemption, some level of sacrifice at the end, and I knew how approximately it was going to appear. But I hit page like 30 and he was like, yeah. He said, the kids, you can keep the kids around. I'm like, I don't want the kids around. I don't want to do Dead Poet Society. That's been done. I want it to be this little tripartite journey of these three people who find and redeem each other. I don't want to have to service for other kids as much as I love those kids. And so I kept going back and forth about ways to get rid of them. And two things happened. One, I came with a helicopter and he said, they fly off in a helicopter. And I said, yeah. And he said, a helicopter comes and takes them away. And he said, David, that's Deus Ex Machina. And I said, yeah, exactly. Precisely. Why are you so, zealously embracing it? I said, look, I went to Yale undergraduate, and I said, I was a scholarship student there. I had like 4 scholarships, or we couldn't have afforded Yale. And I had a friend who at one point was having her 20th birthday, and she said, we're going to have a party. Can you kind of cordon the weekend off? And I thought we were going to go down to Rocky Neck or Weekapaug or some, kind of Connecticut adjacent beach, And we showed up at the corner of College and Wall Street, and there was like basically Aerosmith's tour bus. It was like a rock and roll tour bus. And we were going to Ohio. So we got into this rock and roll tour bus. We partied our asses off all the way to Ohio, partied at this mansion in Ohio, and then drove all the way back. And
with Aerosmith?
No, Aerosmith wasn't in the bus, but it was basically, it had been their tour bus. It was like a rock and roll tour. And I remember, in the early 80s, this is like in the early 80s, thinking to myself, like 84, 85, thinking to myself, the rich are different. The rich are different, they're different. Like if you want to do something like that, you can do that. And it took the form of a tour bus, but I finally convinced him after I enlisted, and he was not wrong. I mean, flying off in a helicopter could readily be just, a cheap way to get rid of people. But I really felt that my experience, especially at Yale, seeing those kind of rich folks, I was like, that's totally doable. Turns out when we actually booked a helicopter, we were trying to land it at Deerfield. We ended up shooting at Deerfield. And the Deerfield trustees came up to us and they were like, you guys can't land a helicopter on the quad. And this has been the script now forever. I finally convinced him. So it'd been in the script for like a year and a half, more than a year, like 2-3 years.
Yeah.
And like, why? And he said, well, all these buildings date back to 1769. And if a rotor clips one of those buildings, you can't replace it. So if any of these buildings get damaged or destroyed, by a helicopter crash, then so you need a $350 million bond, which the production couldn't even begin to afford. And so we're all arguing about it. And I'm a producer on the movie. We're trying to come up with what else could there be aside from a helicopter. And I'm getting really kind of agitated because I'm like, I really want this. And all of a sudden, in the deep background, this guy raises a hand and he says, "It's a trustee of the thing." He says, "Excuse me, can I make a suggestion?" And we said, "Yeah." He said, "Can they land a helicopter on the football field?" And we're like, "Okay, why would you say that?" He goes, "Well, that's where the parents normally land their helicopters." The idea of like, a helicopter was completely vindicated, in the moment. But once he got himself on the helicopter, the other problem was, how do I drive the two of them together? This was the next material juncture in the writing of the screenplay.
Well, can I just interject to say one thing though, David? Like, I don't mean to interrupt, but one thing I love about this film is on the topic of the helicopter is the way that you're almost duped into thinking this is going to be a very different type of movie, a more Dead Poet Society type tale of these kind of lost boys finding solidarity in each other and perhaps in a teacher. Because, well, just when we've adjusted as an audience to Angus's situation and the sadness of that, just when bonds are beginning to form with some of the other kids and you think, oh, great, this situation is survivable together. And this is going to be the tale of this group. That's when you yank them away. And
I read them all like action movies. I created this series called Whiskey Cavalier. It was my first time writing kind of that, and I kind of Jason Bourne Bond kind of thing. It was a TV series for ABC. And what I learned writing it, and something I learned from Shane Black, as you rightly pointed out, many of Shane Black's movies, which are very action oriented often, are all set at Christmas. But, write a drama, write a heartfelt dramedy, but pace it like it's an action film. So, my feeling was like, let's get everybody off in an unexpected way for exactly the reasons you pointed out, my friend. Like, let's subvert expectations, as long as we can do it organically. And that's where I think Alexander's sticking point was. He was arguing that the helicopter might not seem organic, but, as it turned out, I think given the world we were in, the helicopter was fine. But I mean, you're right. I mean, I kind of wanted to shake the Etch-a-Sketch, just kind of like shake the Etch-a-Sketch and like change the audience's expectations and kind of consolidate this little family, these three people, like boil it down to them. And after I got to that, then it was sort of like, okay, they're there together. And then the newlywed game scenes kind of like started coming out as a way to sort of get them to talk about it. I chose the newlywed game because, I remember seeing it a lot as a kid on TV. I was way too young. I was born in 1964. So it's like I was way too young to really watch that stuff in the 70s, late 60s, early 70s. But I remember having it on, and, my mom would watch it, whatever. And having it be this sort of examination of relationships. And I thought they might be watching that at night, and it was an organic way into understanding who they were. So I got all the way through that. And then I'm like, I need to bond these two guys. How do I bond these two guys? How do I do it? And I kept throwing stuff at Alexander, and he was like, "Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know." And I was like, I'm like writing this, and he's like, "No, I'm not quite buying it." Blah blah. And he was right. He's virtually always right. I mean, he's a brilliant writer. And I'm like, yeah, God, you're right. I'm not getting it right. And then I thought to myself, and I was just frustrated, and I laughed. He said, "What are you laughing at?" We were Zooming one day, and I said, "There's this story I want to tell you." And he said, "What is this?" When my son was 10, he had a birthday party. My son is 22 now. He had a birthday party at a tumbling gym, a gymnastics gym, with all these pommel horses. And
I know where this is going.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So one of the kids, this 10-year-old kid, whose mom was here last night, so I won't use his name. The kid knows this. He's the basis of the story now. He's now in his 20s too. He's like 22 now. But this kid had broken his arm recently, and several times, because apparently his bones are fine now, but apparently he had like kind of bird bones when he was younger. So this calcium was still building up, and he loved to do stuff, and he basically broken his arm recently. And this was a tumbling gym party, and he really wanted to go. And so his parents were like, fine, but his parents couldn't attend because they had some other competing obligations. So we were supposed to be looking after him, but they signed the waiver. And we took our eyes off from him. It's like a whole team of parents just sort of like bird dogging these kids, as hovering in helicopter, no pun intended, as parents can be these days. Turned our eyes away for a minute. And this kid, seeing all of his friends do this stuff, just goes running like a madman toward the pommel horse, hits the pommel horse, falls, gets up to prove he's fine, throws his head, but his arm sickeningly goes like back like that, totally broken. And like two of the kids were like, throw up, ambulance comes. And I told Alec, and I said, the kid's fine. Alexander just burst out laughing, And I said, yeah, I mean, he's fine, but it was kind of terrifying and hilarious. He goes, that's awesome. And so I thought to myself, okay, break his arm. But no, we can't break his arm because we have to hide this whole thing. This whole thing's got to be entre nous, right? Ultimately. So dislocating the shoulder, that's what opened up the rest of it. Because what that did, when they get to the hospital, there's a crisis moment. Again, action film, create a crisis moment. They speed to the hospital. All is lost moment. The guy is going to lose his job when they find out because the kid is in the hospital and he's got to fill out the paperwork. Kid drives quite intelligently, drives the lie, my dad and I were playing hockey down at Squan's Pond. Please don't tell her. I don't want mom dragging you back into court, dad, And so Giamatti kind of goes along with it, Now, this is something I learned as a screenwriter in writing The Holdovers. If you put two people on the same side of a lie, whatever the lie can be, or a shameful secret, but some secret that cannot be told, bad house number, never had an affair, but if you're having an affair, I'd imagine, with someone else, I'm married for 25 years, you would keep that quiet, you know what I'm saying? And in keeping it quiet, you're lying to other people, but the intimacy you share with that person, not just sexual intimacy, but also sort of like emotional intimacy and kind of mutually assured destruction kind of thing, creates a bond where you can be intimate and tell secrets to that person because you share this secret with the external world. You know what I'm saying? The moment they were able to share the secret, where Paul goes along with the lie, he's now culpable, as is witnessed by Angus saying, "Now you owe me," and which I love because it was like, that is such a ballsy thing to say, and it's so emblematic of the kid's personality, right?
It's also, David, just to interject again, like another thing I love about it is a bit like in one of the preceding scenes where Angus helps out the kid who wets the bed, and you're like, oh, that's a nice sentimental moment, and then he follows it up with fucking asparagus. Here, like for a moment, for a split second, you think that like some sort of sympathy has flooded Angus and he's doing a nice thing, but then the next moment you yank back from that sentimentality and actually he's doing it to get some leverage over Paul. I love that.
Exactly right. Yeah. Don't try to leverage me, Mr. Tully. Basically, like, look, I'm not looking, I'm just looking to, do something. I just say, I did something nice for you. That's all I'm saying. So they go to the Winning Ticket, which was a bar in New Hartford, Connecticut, or Colebrook, Connecticut, that my dad and I used to go to occasionally. And he wants a beer. So he's going to push it, he's going to push it. Like, how about I get a beer? It's like, you will not get a beer. It's like, I'm not getting a middle high. You already had 10 milligrams of Percodan. That's plenty. So he's going to work the problem, right? And then when I figured out that you can put people on the same side of a lie, which generates a degree of intimacy that can be, expanded upon, you expand upon it, but then, like you said, you owe me, you buy it back, you show that there may be an intimacy, but there's also agendas. No one's ever free of agendas in a relationship. Everybody's got an agenda in a relationship, whether it's spoken or unspoken, whatever. So then basically the next move in the screenplay was to see if I could do it again as they got closer, which I did with Hugh Kavanaugh. But this time, Paul lies, and Angus goes along. Remember, he sort of says, but then he kind of fucks with him a little bit. He kind of goes like, what does he say? He's like, yeah, I'm his nephew Leonard, and he's also writing a book on ancient cameras. It's like, well, the camera obscura. So tell him the title of the book. Oh, they don't want to know the title. He forces him to come up with the title. So he makes Paul lie even further, and then, Paul calls him on it, like, you have no right to judge me. And it was a private conversation. He said, it wasn't a private conversation. Me and the wife were there. And so he pushes Paul, who's desperately searching for his Mickey of Jim Beam, right, for his fifth of Jim. And Paul confesses that he never went to college. So there's another secret, So there's a lie that they're complicit with. And then from an exposition standpoint, more important, a character standpoint, we learn more about the character because now this intimacy has been reinforced with a second lie. So those were the big threshold turns for me in understanding the screenplay. And then sort of the run toward the end late in the second act and the third act was kind of capitalizing on this intimacy and this trust and seeing how far I could take their relationship. And that's separate and apart from the Mary story, which we haven't discussed yet.
That is all fascinating. There are so many things in that I want to come back to. First and foremost, though, we should talk about Mary, who we haven't discussed so far. I know that she was in part based on your mother and the courage that she was forced to muster after your parents' divorce. I know that also, the storyline involving her son was very much based on you imagining what it might have been like if you had been ripped away from her. And it's fascinating. Like, Mary's arc in this film is not as clear-cut or as tidy as mourning woman learns to live again, which a more heavy-handed filmmaker might have swayed towards. It's something more subtle in The Holdovers, something quieter. Can you walk me through it?
Sure. I mean, basically, when I was growing up, again, as a kid, see, the Vietnam War ended when I was like 10, 11. But like I said, lower middle class household. My uncles were, my mother's brothers were janitors at the Wesleyan University in Middletown, Connecticut, and at the courthouse in Middletown, Connecticut. So I grew up around a lot of working class and lower middle class people. And I noticed, even as a kid, that most of the people going to Vietnam were blue collar kids. And keep on, not my age cohort, I'm too young for that, but like my friends' older brothers, and more importantly, their uncles, you know what I'm saying? And this kind of crossed racial boundaries because, we had a group of fairly diverse people in our lives. But I noticed that most, if not all, the kids who were going, the young men who were going, were poor or blue collar, and most of them that weren't coming back were Black and Latino, because as I subsequently found out through some rather extensive research, especially through 66, it tapered off after 66, but if I think Black people are 10% of the US population, they were 13% of the draft pool. And in 1966, I think it was 23% of the major battlefield casualties, deaths and dismemberment and ferocious, terrible casualties were Black soldiers, because that was the way it was sort of like structured. They were put on the front lines. And so I thought, from my own personal experience, how do I create something that feels real from a mother's grief standpoint? And that was sort of kind of a thought experiment with me, kind of imagining what it would be like for my mother if, instead of I lost her when I was fairly young, it was supposed to be me losing her, she lost me. How would she go on? And then thinking about how a Black woman in that situation would be dealing with the social reality of what was going on. And then very carefully, and this is one of the reasons that I wrote Mary, I think I was leaning into Chekhov a lot with some of these silences and some of the actions, because I wanted to create these little tableaus, because I wanted to give space for the actor to fill in their experience, because I knew that I couldn't write in my totality from the experience of a Black woman having had that experience in the 60s. But what I knew I could do was I could create space for someone and hopefully give them the themes and some of the dialogue, so that the acting would take us the rest of the way. And so, I structured Mary that way. And what I wanted from her was not this tidy resolution, but this idea of letting go. I think once you lose a child, I have 2 children, and there are 3 aphorisms that I always think of when I think about kids. One is, you're only happy as your saddest child, which is true. The other one is, to have a child means to have your heart walking around outside your body for the rest of your life, where anybody could take a shot at it. That was actually in the movie. That was part of a scene that was cut. But I wanted her to sort of have to continue with her life, bearing this grief as she would for the rest of her life, but get some degree of closure and understanding. And that's why that scene with the mystery box, that I call the mystery box, where she opens it up and it's his baby shoes and his bottle and his clothes, and she just silently puts it into her, her soon-to-be nephew or niece's room at her sister's house. That's her sort of going, as close as I can come to moving on and passing on the love and the legacy of my son. This is what I'm doing for you, my beloved sister, kind of thing, and that's as far as I thought would be real. I mean, I don't know, you don't recover from that loss, but you can pass on the legacy of this beautiful young man to your sister, and in that way kind of preserve his memory, and the love you had for him. So that was sort of my objective in creating Mary's arc and writing that scene. And then what she does later, just to sit there and hold his hand, and connect with him, is sort of a residual love and understanding that she's kind of, I think that's been amplified in her. I think it was always in her. Witness the fact that she says, you don't tell a boy who's left on at Christmas that you don't want him, right? So she always had that, even before the Curtis scene in the nursery. But the idea that she could have some level, if not closure, but of processing the grief and of getting further along in the grief. That was always the arc that I wanted for her.
What's really special about that scene, I think, is it's between 2 women on separate sides of motherhood. So on one hand, you have Mary, who's recently lost a child. Meanwhile, her sister is expecting a child. This really interesting, really beautiful symmetry going on in that scene. I love that entire segment, the road trip segment of the Holdovers, David. Like, obviously, you had threaded into the movie early that Angus has this desire to go to Boston. He'd pleaded with his mum earlier on to kind of go in Act One. You must have landed on the idea early of it being revealed that his desire to go was rooted in missing his father and wanting to visit him. How did you work out the other components? Because as you touched on, we have the reveal of Paul's backstory. We have Mary and kind of her letting go in that scene. Talk to me about this whole segment and how it came together, why it was important to get out of the school as we move towards the conclusion of the story.
If you're familiar with, and like I said, Alexander's an incredibly close friend of mine and a collaborator, and I think a brilliant writer, is a genius filmmaker.
A great road trip writer as well.
That's it, man. He loves a road trip,
There you go.
And he literally said, like, hey, would it be fun if they went on the road? I was like, dude, surprise, surprise. Go back to Sullivan's Travels. I mean, so many of the great, Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? So many great American movies, and Alexander Payne movies have road trip elements to them. I mean, even, well, certainly not Election, but Nebraska, right? Descendants has that component, Sideways, So a lot of his movies have this component. I wanted to have, basically his mandate was let's have fun. And one of the great things about Alexander, one of the 1,000 great things about him as a friend and as a collaborator, is that he's like never told me what to do. He would have opinions as the director, and I'm spoiled forever because writing for a director like him and having this kind of relationship, you can have a really civilized, calm conversation about the relative components of what we're trying to accomplish, right? We wanted to have fun. And so my feeling was, we need to get to Boston. How much fun can we have in Boston? And there were times in earlier drafts where they picked up a hitchhiker. There were times in earlier drafts where they actually took Dr. Green's car, which was a Bentley, because I'm like, let's take like a Bentley. Let's take like a old school Bentley on the road. But then the Dr. Green character, who in earlier drafts had a stroke and was still alive, they took his car. And this is before, Mary's car was an option. And we're like, oh, we'll just take Mary's car, But, before they've gotten busted for a variety of things, like various complications that occurred. But I started thinking to myself, what's the most fun we can possibly have? What would this kid want to do? And originally, and now it's in the film, you don't see the dialogue. You don't hear the dialogue, right? You see the lip flap, you see they're moving, and there's Mark Orton's brilliant score playing as they're driving to Boston, and they're kind of talking and laughing, right? The dialogue that is blanked out of those scenes is like, a lot of fantastic things. We're going to go see the Museum of Fine Art. There's a special antiquities exhibit. And of course, we'll visit a whaling ship, like that. And he's like, God damn it, So it's like, this was the educational trip he didn't want, So there were conversations about that. But then we thought from kind of a montage standpoint, what would a 17-year-old kid, and sometimes, by the way, I think Dom looks like he's 15 in the movie, and sometimes it looks like he's 25. Like he was 19 at the time, but the way you light him and shoot him, he could look like a kid or like a young man, But let's stipulate that he's a kid in his heart, right? At Christmas. He says, and that's a reverse engineered monologue where he goes, I don't want to sit around here staring at the walls. I want to go to Boston. I want to see a real Christmas tree. I want to go ice skating, see a real Christmas tree, not that stupid thing. I thought you liked it. You said it was nice. It is, but let's boil it down to that, So I thought to myself, okay, great ice skating. Like there's a great movie that was a huge influence on me called The Last Detail by Hal Ashby. There's an ice skating scene in that, So I was like, let's do an ice skating scene originally. And then so let's have fun, right? So then I'd written a winter carnival scene where he is shooting like at this winter carnival game. And again, that was sort of an homage to Last Detail. And I get a call after it was in the script for, again, like a year and a half from Alexander on location going, you're killing me with this carnival. I was like, what's wrong? He goes, I got to get all these picture cars and it's night shooting and it's extras and it's outside. And I'm like, okay, all right, okay, cool. What's going on? He goes, we got to find something else. Got to find it fast. And one of the great virtues of being a TV writer is I hung up the phone and I'm like, okay, fast. So I came up with 3 different scenarios. One was a newsstand. I think another was like a candy store. And then the third one was what we call the Sally Ann, which is a Salvation Army when I was growing up. They call them Sally Ann back east. And he was like thrift shopping and he sees these 2 girls in the thrift shop and flirts with them. And I write these scenes in rapid succession, like 3 hours. I banged out 1 hour per scene because, they're scouting. He really wants to lock this in. We want to like get our first AD and our production designer everything they need as quickly as possible because we're rushing toward production at this point. So I finished the scene, just sent him off. I'm not kidding. 30 seconds after I hit send, phone rings. It's Alexander. I pick it up. He's like, duck pin bowling. I'm like, what? He goes, duck pin bowling. Yeah, you know what? He goes, do you know what it is? I said, yeah, I grew up going, I think there's one in like Worcester, Mass or Acton. He goes, yeah, duck pin bowling. You go, what about it? He goes, we have this duck pin bowling alley, duck pin bowling scene. Click. And I was like, okay. So I just wrote that duck pin bowling scene kind of in the, like, it took me like less than an hour to do it. Cause I sort of, I could see the educational component flipping where he's teaching this guy and he mouths it, you don't see it. But the idea also thematically at one point, we do it as a montage, but Paul's bowling. I thought to myself, it's an educational, an opportunity to flip the educational element of it. So this guy's going to teach now Paul. Angus is going to teach Paul how to do something. And at one point he says, okay, you have to kind of release your wrist like this. Hold on tightly, let go lightly, which to me was going to be a metaphor for what he does with his life at the end. He holds on tightly to Barton, but he sacrifices himself for Angus and he lets go lightly. You can see him mouthing the words because we blanked it out and put more awkward and scary. But you can see him saying like that, which was one of the themes. But being Alexander and a great filmmaker, is like, maybe too explicit, we'll take it out. But was an opportunity for him then to say, you're a pretty good teacher, kid. Too bad most people dislike you, pretty much hate you, but you must know that. And he calls back the thing he says to Paul in the museum, and then once we got back, I mean, the movie could end. The movie really ends, or there are 3 points at which you could end this film. The first point is that kind of tableau, that kind of I talked about from outside, when you just see that the flash and they hear the muffled explosion, they all hug. Boom, end of the movie. Could get the credits there. Similarly, you could go back to Barton, establish the ordinary world, the return of the ordinary world, and when he gives them the makeup exam, and he says something, pick up your pencils in Latin. And he looks at Angus, boom, you could roll the credits there, right? Conceivably, and make it a shorter film. But I always wanted that next chapter, the real third act, where, because I think it's the TV writer in me too, I set up that snow globe, kind of a little homage to Citizen Kane in a way, but I set up that snow globe and I wanted to pay it off. And I just, to me, you want to use, it's like, the old kind of First Nations hunting aphorism, use all parts of the animal. Like, use every single part of the narrative. If we've established the snow globe, how much fun would it be if he'd stolen it, given it to his dad, and his dad tried to cave somebody's skull in with it? What kind of crisis could that precipitate? And so, the road trip section and then the return to Barton all kind of fuel. The road trip section is designed to sort of bond them, also to provide some closure to Mary, or at least some movement in Mary's narrative, and to put them in a position so when they get back, conceivably, again, much like the kids you met at the top who end up all of a sudden leaving in the helicopter, okay, we're back at school. I guess everything's going to be the same or normal. No, it's not, like maybe there's been some incremental movement. No, wait a second. There's a huge crisis that's still coming. But that idea of subverting expectations and using the road trip to sort of reinforce and create the opportunity for a greater degree of bonding, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, there are two things I really want to react to there. Number one, you mentioned Angus and the sort of snow globe reveal that spells disaster for him. He's going to have to go to military school. Of course, as we've been talking about, there is an actual conflict going on, and going to military school, this could spell a very different life for him, given the backdrop of this movie. It's already a disaster, though, for Angus on an emotional level before he's threatened with that, because the sting of going to see his dad, who you feel like he is, in his absence, he is put on some sort of pedestal, and he has thought that there might be some sort of salvation for his loneliness in this father figure. Of course, that idea disappears as soon as he sees his dad, and he sees the degree, well, he just sees how unwell he is. And it's so painful, it's heartbreaking. I love how that's all treated, and the sort of camaraderie that follows, how the other two characters really bond around him. And there are lots of scenes of really beautiful camaraderie, like the Cherise Jubilee. Am I saying that right? Cherise Jubilee in the car park.
That's from life. That I was denied Cherise Jubilee when I was about 9 years old, and that's exactly from life, that whole scene. Yeah.
Oh, no way. The other thing to say about like that end sequence in which, Paul lies for Angus. We have one more lie. He takes the fall for him. He loses his job, which is what he feared at the very beginning of the film. There's this 180 on his part. It feels like the road trip and the whole Christmas break in general has been transformative for him. He wouldn't have fallen on his sword for Angus, for this kid who he, thought of as a lazy, what's the phrase he uses at the beginning of the film? A lazy Philistine. That's how he regards these kids in the beginning. He comes around and something has clearly changed. The experience has unlocked in Paul something that allows him to do this incredibly generous act. What's happened there? How has he come to that realization that not for ourselves alone are we born?
What it really means, yeah. I think there's the scene in which you're saying is the Cherries Jubilee scene, the restaurant scene, which was originally set at Anthony's Pier 4, which has since closed. And so we did another restaurant there. It was a famous Boston restaurant. When the kid tells him the truth, the kid finally tells him the truth, the ultimate truth. And the only truth that's more devastating than the truth of what happened with Angus and his father is the truth that Mary had to suffer through, right? But to tell the truth about he used to be fine, he used to be my dad, that monologue, that I think you can only do a monologue like you have to earn a monologue like that, That's the sort of thing, if you're a bad writer, you put that in the first 5 pages or something, you got to earn that. And so it lands around in a 114-page screenplay or a 106-page screenplay when you cut out the deleted scenes, it lands on page 90, something like that. So it's very, very late in the movie. I just think it was really important to sort of have that kid tell Paul his truth, the ultimate truth, the thing that he would not want to discuss with anybody. Like, he lies, my father's dead. He tries to run away. He doesn't want anybody to see this. He's ashamed. He's ashamed and he's terrified. So the idea that he can tell Paul, I'm ashamed, I'm terrified, I don't know who I am. I don't know what's going to happen to me. I'm lost. I'm alone. I don't have any friends. I'm a fuck up. I do all these terrible things and I'm going to end up getting kicked out and going to Fork Union. To have that sort of reality and to have grown fond of the kid as he has, and have the kid say that, to me, Paul's choice to stay with the only life he's ever known or give it up to save this kid, his mind in a weird way, or at least the mechanism that allows him to do what he does, is created in that moment, in that restaurant scene. So at the end, when he levels that final lie and changes, it's because of what he heard. Well, it's the entire film, but what he heard in that restaurant scene, realizing, what it really means to be an educator, what it really means to be not just a teacher, but, to sort of move this person along. I think Paul spent his life moving people through the school, under the auspices of, the kind of Barton ethos, but to really live that ethos, not for ourselves alone are we born, that stoic ethos also that he embraces, is something else entirely, So I think he makes that sacrifice because of what he learns and what he experiences with the kid. Hopefully that was responsive. I don't mean to ramble on.
No, that was beautiful. David, because you spoke about him so movingly at the beginning of this conversation, I want to end with this question. Have you thought at all about what your Uncle Earl would have made of the Holdovers?
You're gonna get me a little bit here. Yeah, I think he would have. I think he would have said, "Good job, kid." I hope he would have, because even though he was not kind of awkwardly challenged or odoriferous, he had his own challenges. He didn't have hyperhidrosis, but he was his own challenges. He was underestimated by certain people, but he was a giant to me and a hero to many people. And I hope he would have loved it. I think he would have appreciated. He would have soft pedaled his impact on me and kind of recognized a love letter to my mother, and I hope to God that it's funny, I'm tight with his widow and her daughter who we raised, and they both love the movie and they both see him in the movie. So the living memory, the living memory of him in those people means a tremendous amount to all of us, to me especially, and the fact that they recognize it for what it is and appreciate it for what it is and really love it for what it is, tells me that he would have, I think, loved it too,
I think you're right, David. If Miller High Life is the champagne of beers, this has been the champagne of interviews. Thanks for your time, man. Thank you for this movie. And by the way, Thanks for not calling me the human form of penis cancer in the hour or so that we've shared together.
It's never level that. That is one. So that's a bridge too far. I would never do that. Never.
I do appreciate it. David, thank you so much for coming on Script Apart.
Cheers, brother. Thank you so much.
You've been listening to Script Apart. Thank you so much for tuning in. A reminder that if you want to help the show continue to grow, you can join us on Patreon by visiting patreon.com/scriptapart or clicking the link in today's show notes. Thanks again for joining us. We'll see you next time.